The following episode depicts gun violence and murder. Listener discretion is advised. It's January 25th, 2000. Dominick Maiorana receives a phone call from the Worcester Police Department Records Bureau. They notify him that his vehicle, a mint-condition silver 1999 Lexus CS300, was towed weeks earlier to Pat's Service Center on Shrewsbury Street in Worcester. Although the car was in Dominick's name, his son Paul was the only person who drove the car. And Dominick hadn't seen his son since the day after Christmas a month before. After he gets off the phone with Worcester police, Dominick calls the Auburn Police Department and reports Paul has been missing for at least 3 weeks. Later that same night, Paul's frozen body is found in the trunk of the Lexus at Pat's Service Center. The vehicle had been at Pat's for over a week. Welcome to Unsolved Worcester. I'm your host, Dan Yeager. In today's episode, we look at the murder of 21-year-old Paul Maiorana. As we mentioned last episode, the unsolved murder of John Valungas Jr., there appears to be small similarities and coincidences peppered throughout each of these unsolved cases, with larger themes of involvement of family members for better or worse. Many cases with young victims of these crimes having a history of criminal activity, and all with a shadow overcast of darker elements, something more sinister at work to keep these murders unsolved. It's no different with the case of Paul Maiorana. Once again, like the Valungas case, although this time seemingly coincidental, Pat's Service Center makes an appearance in this unsolved case. And like John Valungas, Paul Maiorana lived in Auburn. And like Valungas, Paul was just 21 years old. For as large a city as Worcester is, many people from here will tell you it's much more like a small town. Everyone knows everyone, or everyone knows someone that knows you. And everyone from Worcester defends this city vehemently. And many from here keep this city's secrets safe. Over the next year or so, we will continue to highlight the similarities between each case as they become more and more visible as we move from episode to episode. We'll remind our listeners of the names and places that come up more than once, and we will try to illustrate the patterns of crime in these unsolved murders that feel very Worcester. We feel comfortable in saying that pattern continues in the unsolved murder of Paul Maiorana. Paul had been missing for nearly a month. His dead body found frozen in the trunk of his car weeks after he was murdered in early 2000. Paul was shot in the face, and his body was stuffed inside the trunk of his own car. Unsolved Worcester takes a deep dive every Tuesday and Thursday into the unsolved murders and missing persons cases under investigation by the Worcester Police Department's Detective Unit. We will be looking to the past, to unsolved murders as far back as the early 1950s and 60s. The approach to Unsolved Worcester is this: shine a light on each of these cases, put a life behind each victim's name, provide a timeline of events and important details, and ask questions that still need to be answered. Our goal is to remind residents of the Worcester area, both past and present, that there are dozens of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases that need resolution. We hope we can be the spark needed to solve a case. An exact timeline of the murder of Paul Maiorana is difficult to pin down. His body was found frozen. According to reports, temperatures had dipped into the single digits or below zero for much of early January 2000. And here's what we do know. Paul was last seen by his father on December 26, 1999. Dominick Maiorana told police it wasn't unusual for his son to be out of touch for weeks on end. That's why he waited so long to report Paul was missing. For over 2 weeks, Paul's car was parked on Eastern Avenue in Worcester before police had it towed to Pat's Service Center on January 19, 2000. On January 25, 2000, Worcester police alerted Dominick that his car was in storage at Pat's. Subsequently, Dominick reported Paul missing and then went to Pat's to see the vehicle. Dominick didn't open the trunk, and according to reports, no one at Pat's opened the trunk of the car either. It wasn't until an Auburn police officer investigating Paul's whereabouts went to Pat's to search the vehicle that Paul's body was found in the trunk. Paul had been shot in the cheek, and the bullet had lodged in his head. It was the middle of winter, but Paul's body was found with a sweater and pants. He wasn't wearing a coat. To understand how a young man might end up dead in his own trunk, we have to go back and look at what was going on in Paul's life just months before his murder. Paul was unemployed at the time of his death. He had previously worked as a sales consultant at Worcester Computer Company, according to his obituary. Prior to late 1999, Paul didn't have much of a police record. Nothing more than a few marijuana possession arrests and driving with a suspended license. But on November 3rd, 1999, Paul was one of 3 suspects who orchestrated a home invasion armed robbery of a 17-year-old man in Maine. According to reports, Paul and 2 other young men robbed the teen at gunpoint, stealing thousands of dollars worth of gold jewelry and a few $100s in cash. They then stole the teenager's car and fled the scene. Paul was the only one of the 3 suspects that didn't wear a mask during the home invasion, and shortly after, the victim was able to identify him to police. Police later reported Paul had been involved in drug dealing, and the teenager he helped rob had also been involved in drug dealing. Police said they knew each other, and that's why the teenager was able to identify Paul so easily. Paul was later arrested in Franklin, Massachusetts, and charged as a fugitive from justice. He had been scheduled to appear in York County Superior Court in Maine just days before Christmas 1999, but he had never showed up. The last known person to see him was his father around Christmas Day. Weeks later, he was found in the trunk of his car. While Worcester police detectives did travel to Maine to speak with local police about the home invasion, they weren't able to connect anything between the robbery and Paul's murder months later. It's hard to imagine that Paul Maiorana didn't know the person that killed him. He was driving a 1999 Lexus in mint condition. The vehicle was worth about $50,000. The vehicle was easily identifiable. In fact, the one thing his neighbors in Auburn did tell police and reporters what they remember about Paul was the Lexus, and Paul installing speakers in the vehicle's trunk. But for over 20 years, police still haven't cracked how Paul ended up in the trunk with his speakers. There have been no reports that Paul was robbed. There were no reports of gunshots from neighbors on Eastern Avenue, where Paul's car was towed from. And if the Lexus was abandoned on Eastern Avenue with Paul in the trunk, there's been no indication of who may have driven the car there. Which, of course, poses the question, where was Paul killed? At least one report says Paul was shot in the face while he was inside the trunk. This episode is unlike many of the cases we will present over the next several months, and we won't make it a habit to speculate on how the victims of these murders were killed. But today, we're asking our listeners to allow us to bend our own rules. We have a theory. It's our opinion that Paul knew his killer, that the killer was waiting for Paul, and approached Paul while he was working on or fixing his speakers in the trunk of his Lexus, pushed Paul in and shot him in the face, and then stole the vehicle and abandoned it on Eastern Avenue in Worcester. However, whether or not Paul's death was in response to the home invasion in Maine, or something gone terribly wrong with a drug deal or a completely random act of violence, we still don't know. Thank you for listening. Anyone with information about the murder of Paul Maiorana are asked to contact the Worcester Police Detective Bureau at 508-799-8651 or send an anonymous text to 274-637. Write TIPWPD and your message, or send an anonymous web-based message at worcesterma.gov/police. I'm Dan Yeager. Come back next time when we look at the unsolved murder of Jonathan Kapulka on July 3rd, 2012. Jonathan was shot and killed on Grafton Street while watching the city's fireworks with his family. Be sure to visit Unsolved Worcester on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Unsolved Worcester. Listen to all episodes for free at unsolvedworcester.com and podcast streaming platforms including Spotify, iTunes, and more. Special thanks to Harvest Design in Northborough. The extensive research provided by Alex London and the Worcester Public Library. The Worcester Police Department, the City of Worcester, Ron Scott at New England Sky Picks, and our sponsors for making this possible. The Unsolved Worcester podcast music is provided by Tom Lebelzik of the Worcester Jazz Collective. This episode of Unsolved Worcester is written and produced by Pat Sargent. Drone footage provided by New England Sky Picks. Videography and editing by Colin Turner. Victim images are courtesy of the Worcester Police Department. Sponsorship information announcer is Chandler Walsh. Unsolved Worcester website and logo art by Harvest Design. Visit harvest-design.com. Be sure to check out the video for this episode with exclusive aerial views and more on our Unsolved Worcester YouTube page. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.